Hey drumming world, so have you ever thrown a new head on your snare drum, got it all tuned up and everything, and then just realized that you got way too many overtones, too much of that extra ringing that just goes on forever and ever? Well, today I'm going to go with you 5 different ways to kind of control the extra overtones that you have. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons in each one of those. So before we start looking at the 5 different ways to control overtones, I do want to talk about what it is that we really want to do, right? We want to cut down on how long the overtones are going on for, and we don't want to impact sound quality, volume, right? We want to basically get that nice snare sound, that initial hit, and then we almost want like a gating or expander effect for those of you in the pro audio recording world, right? We want to shorten the decay time or the release time of the snare sound. So let's start going through the 5 different options that we have and see which ones are going to work best for us. So first up is what's called a muffler. You actually won't see this on all snare drums. Mostly you'll see this on snares that might be used in a, say, concert band or like orchestral setting. A muffler is basically this big piece of foam that sits inside the drum. There is a little tuning knob that you can use to affect how much tension there is. So basically how hard this thing is pushing up against the inside of the snare. This is against the batter side of the snare drum. This is probably the worst option that you could employ, and that's because it really cuts down on the volume, right? It has a huge impact on the sound quality. Again, if you're in a concert band or orchestral setting, and the conductor is yelling at you because you're playing too loud, then this might be a good situation for that. But if you're a rock band, jazz band, you're playing out, you're recording in the studio, for all those situations, this is not what you want to go with. The second option we're going to look at is tape. This is actually a fairly inexpensive option. Usually this is a Duct tape or a Gaffers tape. And you just put a little piece on your snare drum and you should be good to go. It's not going to affect the volume or the tone nearly as much as the muffler, but it is still going to have an effect on those two things. Especially if you start to go crazy. I've seen drummers who will put on 8 pieces of tape where they'll basically draw a giant square on their snare, and once you get to that extent, yes, it is going to have a big impact on tone and on volume. Another issue with using tape, especially a tape like duct tape, is it leaves a residue on your snare. So even when you take that tape off, there's still gunk on the snare, and besides not looking pretty and kind of like being this little sticky annoyance on there, that residue being left there is going to have tonal effects. So if you're the kind of person who wants to put the duct tape on when you're in the studio, and then that weekend you're going to play out live and you want to take it off, it's not going to be how it was before. The other issue is with placement. So if you're only using 1 or 2 little pieces, but you're trying to find the right spot, every single time you're sticking it on or taking it off, you're weakening that glue basically that's on the tape. And there's also risk that the tape will fold in on itself and you just have to throw it away and get another piece. So for this third option, we're going to start looking at some consumer products. And the first consumer product we're going to look at is tone rings or tonal rings. This particular one that I picked up to demonstrate to you guys is from Remo, and it's called the Rem-O ring. These are obviously a lot more expensive to go with than just buying a roll of tape, but they are reusable, right? Every time you replace the head, you don't have to replace this Rem-O ring. So the life of them is much longer. So it's a little bit less expensive in the long run that way. So how these things work is that you sit them down on the snare or on one of your toms, you hit the drum, and they actually vibrate off ever so slightly when you first hit them. And then they settle back down. So in this manner, it actually opens up a little bit, so it doesn't have as big of an effect on the initial volume or the initial tone of the drum, which is getting us to where we want to go, right? We don't want to affect the tone and the volume as much as we want to affect the release and decay, right? We would want to just control the overtones. One issue with this option is that I still feel that these are too much. They're kind of impacting the overall tone, the overall overtones too much. They're also sized a certain way, right? So in this pack that I picked up, they're all even numbered O-rings. But what if I had a 13-inch snare, right, or a 13-inch tom? One benefit of these, though, over, say, the tape, of course, is that they just come off whenever you need them, right? So if going back to that studio versus live situation, it's no problem just to throw it on in the studio, take it off. There's no residue or anything left over once it's off. So the fourth option we're going to look at, and this is my favorite one of the group, this is the sticky gel option. So, Moongel, Drumdots. It's basically this little pre-made sticky piece of gel. It's almost like a silicone material. It doesn't affect the tone. It doesn't affect the volume. It just is impacting the overtones and how long that decay is, right? So this is finally getting us to where we want to get to, right? Affect the decay, almost like a gate or an expander. Don't affect the original initial sound of the snare. Placement with this is actually really important. Further in on the snare you place it, the more overtones it'll cut back on. Unlike the tape, you can easily put it on and off and move it around as you're trying to find that ideal spot for you. Going back to the live situation before, compared to the tonal rings, it's a much better option there as well. Again, these are sticky. So as you're throwing your drums on and off the stage, they're gonna stay on, as opposed to those tonal rings, which is just gonna slip right off. The big downside to these is that it is definitely the most expensive option. A small pack of these is gonna cost you $7 to $11, and they do wear out over time. They lose the stickiness and they dry out. So you'll have to replace them. One other minor issue, and this comes up in live situations, is what happens if you go to stack the drums. So in my case, I put drum dots on my snare, but I also put them on my two floor toms. And when I stack those floor toms up, the rim sits on the drum dot underneath it. The last option we're gonna look at is with specialized drum heads. So this would be like the Powerstroke 3 heads, which are made by Remo. This is along the same lines of those tonal rings, only in this case, it's actually built into the drum head. So this is on the inside, this will be on your batter side head. And it's just a little piece of plastic that sits, like I said, on the inside. When you hit the drum, it's gonna open up a little bit and then it's gonna close and then cut the sound. The amount that it's cutting back, it's probably along the same lines of those tonal rings. So it's for me, it's a little aggressive, especially for the snare, but if that's the amount of cut that you want, then it's probably a better option for you, especially for live situations, than using the tonal rings. What I really like this option for is on the bass drum, right? So the bass drum, the head is vertical. And if I were to try to put anything like a drum dot on that, it's not gonna stay on as well, especially as the stickiness starts to wear off. Plus, since bass drums tend to be a little bit boomier anyhow, they'll probably need a little bit extra tonal control. So do you guys have any go-to options for controlling your tone, controlling ring, buzz? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe.